Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the FitBigStrong podcast. Today is going to be a very interesting video and podcast. Speaking of which, we had a bit of an upgrade on equipment. So now I have like this filter, and I've got like this stand thing, right? But the filter covers like half my face, and so we've got a video upgrade because half my face is covered. And we also have an audio upgrade because the stand is now close to my mouth and there's a filter, so like you can't really hear as much of the background noise. Man, we are one step closer to that Joe Rogan quality. And it's also an exciting episode because we had 10 downloads on the first episode. I don't know why I didn't share that last episode, but I'm very excited about it. And so that's really cool. I'm very happy with how this is going, and I'm so excited to talk about today's topic. Is milk the next anabolic steroid? What? What are you talking about, Ashton? Well, it is if you're an idiot. And if you're an idiot, you should stop being an idiot. Where am I going with this? I have no idea. So, that's a really big statement, Ashton. Is milk the next anabolic steroid? It is. So what is it that we're actually going to talk about? Well, there is a couple studies, about 3 I found, which paints milk in a very interesting light. Okay, and it shows it a bunch of benefits, and I'm like, that's a bit weird. Like extremely good benefits, and really strange findings as well. And so, and I wanted to kind of debunk those because it'd be fun. But we're also going to talk about the legitimate benefits of drinking milk, if you were to consume it. Some limitations of the research that we are going to talk about. And then we're going to be like, okay, well, what are the downsides of drinking milk, particularly in general, and maybe in this context as people who are interested in performance. And then we're just going to have a general discussion about poor research, because that's really important to round out our conversation on, because if you're going to get anything apart from this podcast, apart from entertainment, is hopefully something valuable. Because talking about milk, I'm not sure if that's extremely valuable. So we'll add something. So, according to these studies, milk is basically trend. I know, it's crazy. So there was one study, which was just kind of weird. It showed that there was a higher net protein synthesis when you drank full cream milk post-workout than skim milk in isocaloric conditions. So that means with the same calories equated, it showed better net protein synthesis. It's like, what? And there was another study which found that a liter of milk post-workout, this was full cream, resulted in less creatine kinase present in the blood after about 48 hours. Just for some context, creatine kinase is an indicator of muscle damage. And so theoretically, if there was less muscle damage compared to a placebo, there's more recovery, because there's less muscle damage, more was recovered. That's the theory. And there was one study, it basically found that milk was extremely insulinogenic, which basically means it excretes a lot of insulin. So for example, growth hormone is quite insulinogenic because it raises blood sugar, and therefore that really results in more insulin release. But we can kind of calculate roughly or estimate roughly the impact of a carbohydrate source on insulin. So, for example, I'm making this up, but let's say 20 grams of carbohydrates results in 20 IUs of insulin. I made that up. Don't think that's legit. It's just for reference. And so then we can go, okay, 50 grams does this, 40 grams does this, etc., etc. So that's the thinking. And what they found is that milk, it did 3 times the expected result that they calculated using their calculations. And I'm like, whoa, like that's awesome, because insulin is so anabolic. It's actually more anabolic than tren. It's like bodybuilders aren't using tren in their off season to gain 40 pounds of muscle over like 2 years. They're using growth hormone and insulin, mainly through the IGF-1 pathway. So like that sounds sweet, right? It's like, oh my god, why is milk so powerful? Well, we're going to cover that later. But firstly, let's give milk a bit more power. So So this is just some quick benefits of milk if it is something you're interested in drinking post-workout or maybe otherwise. Well, firstly, you're sweet when it comes to protein because it is a super high quality source of protein. It's extremely bioavailable and it has what's called a 3-to-1 casein to whey ratio, which sounds like really fancy, but casein is the type of protein which breaks down over a long period of time. So you're having a slow release of amino acids when you consume it, and then whey is kind of like fast acting, but it dips quicker. So post-workout, you get a big spike of amino acids when your muscles are getting extremely sensitive to amino acids. And while the muscles are also elevated in their sensitivity, you're providing a slow release. So that sounds really good. Like, milk's just an awesome quality protein. And you wouldn't want it to be like 100% whey, because like if you assumed digestion was the same, the issues with drinking whey is that it's only going to be elevating your bloodstream for like 90 minutes in isolation. So like you kind of want a bit of a combination, especially when you're not combining it with anything else. But you probably do combine it with anything else, so it probably stays elevated for longer. But in my thoughts, probably not long enough. And it's really rich in like dietary fats and like the good kind. So it's quite high in saturated fats, and not the palmic acids and the bad saturated fats, but the good ones. And that's awesome because it's also really rich in vitamins and minerals, which, like, guess what? Vitamins and minerals, some of those are carried by fat to be absorbed. So it's like you see people taking minerals and vitamins, and some of those minerals and vitamins are fat soluble and they don't have fat. So it's like not only are you getting really good fats, but your body is able to absorb the minerals because of those fats. And so it's like really high in like calcium. And interestingly enough, with milk, calcium is so bioavailable in dairy products. It's unbelievable. And there's a lot of quite high in potassium as well. And interestingly enough, the literature on high blood pressure, they found that even with a diet high in sodium, with the absence of potassium, that's where they saw high blood pressure. So with people with really high processed food diets. But when people had like moderate to high sodium and high potassium, they didn't have any effects on blood pressure. Like they had a normal blood pressure range. So that's really interesting. And potassium is essential in the activation of muscle fibers and the central nervous system. It plays a key role in the action potential. And then you've also got your B vitamins, which are essential, especially for energy and testosterone production. So it's just, and look, there's so many more. I could list them all, but like, let's face it, milk is a rich source of nutrients, basically. And like, it's got a pretty decent amount of carbohydrate content, which post-workout or in general, I'm a huge fan of carbohydrates because of their impacts on insulin. And why is insulin good? I thought insulin was bad. Well, it's really good because it's muscle preserving in a deficit, and it adds like a bit of extra anabolism when you're bulking. And so when you're bulking, you kind of base your diet around carbohydrates, you actually gain more muscle by the end of the day. So let's say assume your insulin resistance decreases as you get fatter. Well, if you go from 80 kilos to 90 kilos, you're probably going to be more insulin sensitive in the end of the day by eating carbohydrates in that bulk because you gain more muscle. And because you have less fat, you're comparatively less insulin resistant. Does that make sense? So that's really why I like carbohydrates, and it's got a decent amount in it. So that's something to consider, especially skim milk. I know, look, dietary fats, I just gave you a rant, but if you're just wanting more carbohydrates and less fat for a post-workout scenario, skim milk has comparatively more carbohydrates, so that's something else. It's really like when it comes to listing off benefits, it's benefits in what context. So just keep that in mind. And in my opinion, it tastes fucking awesome. Like, it's so good. Like, I could chug just a straight glass of milk. There's gonna be a huge debate, I know it, between people who love milk and people who don't. But I'm one of the people who absolutely loves milk. So, yes, you can call me weird all you want, but I enjoy a glass of milk. Okay, and look, it's quite cheap. Some people may disagree, but even powdered milk, it's just so cheap. In fact, I only know this because I like to save money. Skim milk. So skim milk from Coles, which is like a shopping brand in Australia, it's 6 times cheaper to go from the refrigerated to the powdered. So and it's like for like one serve, it's like 10 cents. So it is extremely cheap for most people. If you can't really afford that, then I'm sorry. Like, I genuinely am. But it's pretty cheap. So that's another benefit. But a small one. Okay. Now, let's break down this research. The first study. So just to reiterate, this is the study that found higher protein synthesis comparing the high-fat milk to skim milk. And that was really strange. And I looked into the findings, and they weren't statistically significant. So you read the abstract, it says it's awesome benefit. I'm like, oh, cool. And then you read the data, and it's not even statistically significant on their analysis. And I'm like, what? There we go. So the findings weren't actually accurate, but people take it as gospel. And there was another fact, is that they gave a single serving of milk, and they didn't account for body weight. So what that means is, if you give me 10 grams of protein, and I weigh 60 kilos, and you give 10 grams of protein to somebody who weighs 80 kilos, the person who's got 80 kilos will likely experience less anabolism, because relative to their body weight, they are consuming less protein. Because the protein demands of somebody increases when you increase their body weight. And so it's very possible that the higher fat group was just weighed less. And because they weighed less, they received more of an anabolic response. And then, therefore, they would have measurably more muscle protein synthesis. Because they just have more resources as a result relative to everybody else. And so that's a finding which they didn't account for. And I couldn't see any evidence as to them attempting to as well. So I'm like, that kind of sucks. All right. Let's look at this second study. So this was the, basically they compared having a liter of water post-workout as a standard. And then they had compared 500 mils of full cream milk and 1,000 milligrams of full cream milk. So half a liter and a liter. And what they found is that the 1,000 milligram showed elevated muscle protein synthesis 48 hours after. They showed reduced creatine kinase 48 hours. And I'm like, interesting, cool, that sounds good. Again, it was lacking statistical significance. Again, and only that, like, we're about to break down the study, it's kind of suspicious because they didn't compare the 500 milligram milliliter milk consumption to the placebo. In their data, they did not compare the results from drinking a liter of water to 500 milligrams of milk. And the reason being, I believe, and their rationale is that they didn't have a 500 milligram water control. But we're talking about 500 mils of water and a liter of water are isocaloric. They're the same calories. And they're the same composition, apart from one's got more water. But maybe you might see a difference in the concentration of things because of the water volume and how that saturates cells. But I still don't see why they couldn't just do a comparison and just list that there's a difference, which I found really suspicious because it only showed a greater impact between 1,000 and 0. Because, that's really interesting, and we're going to break down why I think that's important in a second. But I looked at the data, and I'm like, okay, what was statistically significant and what? The only data point that showed any potential statistical significance was 1,000 milligrams compared to 1,000 milligrams of milk compared to 1,000 milligrams of water. It was the only data point. And when you compared the 24-hour time point, 48-hour time point, 72-hour time point after the intervention, and the 500 milligram milk consumption versus 1,000 milligram milk consumption, basically every possible scenario that you can compare, only that one data point was statistically significant to any extent. That just shows you that the data wasn't even very good, and it's likely that this was just based on chance. And then I think to myself, would the results differ? Would we see elevated increases if we just gave them equivalent carbohydrate, fat, and protein intake? Well, most likely. Of course, when you work out afterwards and all you do is drink water, of course you're not going to have elevated, of course you're not going to see improvement in biomarkers because you didn't give yourself any protein. You didn't stimulate any anabolism. So, of course, 48 hours later, you're not going to see anything. And, if the person just ate an hour later, they would see differences. But, they straight up just said, all right, here's some hamstring, sets of hamstring curls to failure and, 5 sets of 10, 30-second rest, 90-second rest. And then just, leave, drink a liter of water, we'll take your bloods and leave. And then come back. They didn't instruct them on, what to eat afterwards or how to eat or anything like that. So, of course, giving somebody extra protein, 20 grams worth of protein, and, 40 grams of carbs is going to do something. And so, that's where I think it's suspicious that, they didn't even see a difference between 500 milligrams of milk and 1,000 milligrams. But they only saw a difference when you compare no milk to a liter of milk. But they didn't even compare 500 mils of milk to no milk at all. They didn't compare that. It's why not? Did you not even find a finding there either? And you just didn't want to show that? So I just found the study really weird. It's almost like they're trying to say that milk increases anabolism post-workout. Well, does milk do it? Or does protein, carbohydrates post-workout do it? And it's that, in my opinion. There's nothing special about milk. It's a really good source of carbs and protein. So, that's my perspective. Alright. I also want to discuss, is creatine kinase a good measurement of muscle protein synthesis? So just to reiterate, higher creatine kinase results in higher muscle protein breakdown. So if you had less of that present, you're probably recovering better compared to somebody who has more. That's the theory. But for me, it's like a blood marker that can be easily manipulated. So if you just took creatine, you're going to have high elevated creatine kinase. If you drink alcohol, you're going to. If you're poorly hydrated, you're going to. If you just exercise, you're going to, like the study showed. And then even your protein intake's going to elevate it. If that person, if the data group which showed more, showed more creatine kinase than the intervention group. So the group that had a liter of milk showed less, so more recovery. Well, maybe the group that had a liter of water was so hungry that when they got home that they just started smashing heaps of protein, and then that extended throughout the rest of the day, and then boom, they have slightly elevated creatine kinase, and then the data is not statistically significant because they just didn't control for the diet after the intervention. They just said come back in and we'll, So I just think I don't think it's the best measurement, but we don't have much when it comes to biomarkers. So it's a difficult one, but I still don't think it's necessarily the best measurement, and those are some of its limitations in my opinion. All right, so this was one of my favorite studies because I was like, what? There's no way this is possible. No way. I was genuinely excited when I saw that it said that insulin released 3 times, milk released 3 times the amount of insulin. So what the hell? This is some anabolic milk. I was so stoked. And then I read the paper from 1988 and I'm like, oh, damn it. And then I realized the study didn't account for the insulin affecting properties of protein. They calculated their insulin impact purely on carbohydrates, and they ignored protein. But protein has an insulinergic effect. It's less than carbohydrates, but it still results in insulin release. So it's what? Of course their calculations are going to be wrong. Because you're only showing one part of the, if you consider insulin release as total load, it's let's say it's insulin in the body equals the amount of carbohydrates plus the amount of proteins, and then over time, right? And then so you can assume there's going to be a certain amount. But if they just completely remove a variable, which is protein, and then milk also happens to have heaps of protein, of course the finding is going to show that it's more insulinergic than expected. And interestingly enough, the study had 13 participants firstly, and they're all in different groups. So I actually think it was only like 4, because they did like 3 studies in one. There was like only think like 4 people who participated in the milk one. So like that's accurate. And they were all diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So it was an extremely small sample size in an unhealthy population. Like, I don't really think it's going to make that much of a difference that they have diabetes. But it could, because they might be releasing even more insulin. But like, who knows? Because you didn't do it on healthy populations. Like, that's the issue we have. And so it was just a really, really bad study. And I was really disappointed because I want that damn insulin, you know? So, yeah, it's a bit doom and gloom at the moment. Milk isn't hyped up to be what it is. But let's look at like some potential downsides of milk in this context. Well, if you're lactose intolerant, you're kind of stuffed unless you get like lactose-free milk. But then like some people who are lactose-free think they're lactose-free, but it's actually they're too sensitive to the proteins within milk. And so like dairy products, it's not that they're lactose intolerant, it's just that they can't handle the types of proteins. So that's really interesting. And you actually can buy a milk called A1 milk, and it kind of takes away those most sensitive proteins. And so they're basically fine. But like even like whey proteins and stuff, like I don't know if there's been like good proteins that kind of account for that, but whatever. Some people think milk is gross. Weirdos. It's really calorically dense, so if you're on like a diet, then maybe that's a bad idea. And it's also less satiating per calories because it's a liquid. So if you were to compare if you compared 100 calories from solids and 100 calories from liquids, the 100 calories from liquids are going to fill you up less, and then so you'll be hungry more, which is great for trying to gain weight, but not if you're trying to lose it, or even maintain in some cases if just you can't handle hunger. And it's really hard to store, like unless it's powdered, like the refrigerated milk, it's going to last like, you can't leave it on the counter like you can other things. And so that's just I was really, really trying to think of some downsides like I was the positives, just to kind of make this podcast not that biased. And that was one of them. And clearly it isn't as hyped as we said it was, which is really, really, really disappointing. Like I was looking forward to some like anabolic milk, you know, but it is what it is. Okay. So this is kind of like the phase of the podcast where we're going to talk about poor research. And like, where should you get your information from? So to kind of phrase this, you've probably discovered now that it's pretty easy to manipulate data and findings. So you can either just not show data or not make comparisons in your data analysis, or you can just straight up mess up the pre-calculations, or you can just make bold statements based on the data. And so it's easy to manipulate data to get what you want. You know, data paints a story, but how you interpret the data is what story you get, you know? And so that's something to consider as well. And just like, if you just read the summary, you're also not researching. So people, they'd be like, they call themselves science gurus, they read like the abstract and then they post it and they go, look at this cool finding. It's like, bro, you didn't even read it. If you read just the abstract on those 3 studies I mentioned, man, you would think milk is next level, but we broke it down and we found some flaws. So it's like, what? It's just like, you get what I mean? So there's an issue there when you just read the abstract. It's like, man, you got to read the whole study, and the reality is you have to become scientifically literate if you want to be making claims based off research. And it's just like, why don't you just stick to a different method? And we're about to talk about that now. And that is this is, in my opinion, is my advice and my way of beginning your journey into finding credible information. Because for me, it doesn't begin by just looking at studies first, like straight up, not even systematic reviews. So let's look at it now. So what I do, the first thing I recommend is to develop a discerning nature. So what do you mean by this? What I mean by this is learn to think. Don't just take what people say to heart. Learn about the ways you're biased. Like, oh, she said that, so this has to be right. like confirmation bias is a really big one when it comes to this, because people listen to gurus and then they about, oh, well, this guru is popular, so therefore, or this guru knows what he's talking about, or he has a PhD. It's like, I know it's on average, if somebody is more popular and they have a more higher education, they're more likely to be correct than someone who's not. But expert opinion is the lowest form of credibility in science. It just is. And so you need to develop a discerning nature. And like reading a blog article is just as bad, if not worse. So if you go like, oh, no, such and such said this, like such and such said that like potassium intake is actually really bad for you. And I'm like, what? And then they go, yeah, look, I'll just Google it on a Google, right? And then they find a blog article, or like healthline.com, which healthline.com is generally pretty good, but it's still technically expert opinion. And they read a finding, and you go, okay, cool. So like the only actual way to understand what you're doing here is develop a discerning nature and learn to think critically and question things, question everything, but do it in a way in which it's based on curiosity. So you're actually trying to learn. Because if you don't, then you're just kind of like, you're just being an asshole who's all snobby. Like, I've been there, to be honest. Like, you don't trust anybody. It's not about trust. It's about being discerning and curious and looking for evidence. But also understanding who's more likely to be the most evidence-based. And so, that brings me on to what I'm going to talk about next, is find leading thinkers within your niche. So for me, that's people like Dr. Mike Israetel, Eric Helms, those kind of top scientists within my industry. That's who I look up to. And that's who those are the kind of equivalents you should be finding within your niche to develop your information from. Because, you know, like, they're credible, they've been fact-checked, and they've done their research. Like, some of them have actually published research themselves. And so, like, those are the people you should be looking out for. That's the second step after developing a discerning nature. And then listen to them. Listen to how they speak. Do you feel like you need to be discerning with them? So, for example, if someone talks to you and they go, this is Keto 500 is the best way to grow muscle. And then you go, why? And they go, it's the best. And like, yeah, buy my program. You just got to think to yourself like, what? It's like, or if they say to you, yeah, look, I think, you know, I've undergone my own nutrition based on some principles. There's a high protein intake for supporting satiation. And like they go on and they go, so where does keto fall into this? Well, it follows the principles in this way, but doesn't in this. So my position is this. You know, like they come through with, they give you a why to everything. And it's not a why which is like, I'm smarter than you. Because then again, that's confirmation bias. And we don't want that. So listen to them and be discerning. And then you learn how to read science. So now, so by listening to these people, you've also built a foundation of knowledge. And they've likely also distilled the discerning nature into you further. And so now it's learn how to read science. So watch YouTube videos on reading science. And just understand what the different parts of research papers are. And understand technical analysis a little bit. And then you can look at findings and go, I mean, like, that seems like a little weird. Or like, damn, that's some good research. And then like, boom. Once you've learned how to read science, you can move on to systematic reviews. Because that is basically a systematic review, if you don't know, is like a bunch of scientific papers and journals into one scientific paper. So they summarize the research, basically. And sometimes these are opinion-based. There are low-quality systematic reviews, but that's okay because you know how to read science now. You know how to discern this. And it also points you into pictures of different research. So you can look into that and go, is this good research? Are that they're basing their systematic review off? And so like, that's a real big benefit. And so you read the systematic reviews and you get an idea of literature on yourself. So now you know the research yourself. And then you start to look at individual studies. So that's kind of like the tier list of how to actually get your information. Is so you start by developing discerning nature. You find thinking leaders within your industry. and then you listen to them, and then you learn how to read science, and then you read systematic reviews, and then you go to papers. People straight up, they just Google science is keto good. They see one paper, they don't know what it actually says. They read the abstract, and then boom. It's like, what? As I said, I don't think keto is necessarily a devil. I think it's got some applications, but it's just an example of a fad which people throw around. They act like they've done their research. It's like, you have not done your research, mate. You've listened to Bob Joe's Keto 800 diet, and then you expect to know everything. It's like, oh my god. It actually drives me insane. It really does. So, what are the take-homes on this podcast? Unfortunately, milk isn't tren. It's not any kind of steroid, unfortunately. And look, if you want tren-like results, you just got to take tren, But seriously, don't take tren. That's a really bad idea. I don't encourage that. Maybe just stick to milk. But milk can be a useful post-workout drink, just like any other high-carb, high-protein meal. Sorry. And just don't be a Dumbo and read summaries when you're doing research. But that's what I have for you today. Hopefully you've gained some value from this podcast and this episode. I sure as hell had a lot of fun ranting about milk. What a strange thing to say. Where is my life going to? I'm sitting in my room. It is very hot today. The fan is off. You can probably hear cars and birds behind me because this isn't a soundproofed room. And it's the middle of Australian summer, and I'm filming a podcast with a microphone up to my mouth talking about milk. Anyways, why don't you go finish this podcast and go to your friends, or maybe even your girlfriend? I don't have any of those. So I'm just going to cry and edit this podcast. So, see yas.